Fears of hacked elections could lead to a new election security officer for Kansas. Plus, the rush to get a constitutional amendment on abortion onto the August ballot. It's already underway. Plus, how should Kansas spend your tax dollars this next year? We hear the governor's ideas. That's what we're talking about right now on Kansas Week. I'm Pilar Pedraza, and this is Kansas Week. The 2020 legislative session got underway this week, and the first week always includes several big topics, the biggest of which is perhaps the unveiling of the governor's proposed budget. Let's take a look at what she thinks the state should do with your tax dollars.
I think it's fair to say that another recession is not if, but when.
The budget would pay off more than $600 million in state debt while offering a new grocery sales tax refund and sending money back to the counties for property tax relief.
I think it's a budget we can work with.
Most something to like, from increasing the money going to higher education to repairing the troubled Osawatomie State Mental Hospital.
I like the fact that we're finally putting some money in regional mental health areas.
There were concerns about the fact the budget still borrows from the Bank of KDOT, though more than $70 million less than last year. And it calls for refinancing of the state's debt to the public pension program, increasing the overall cost.
We're just shifting the money around and trying to get the savings by re-amortizing capers as opposed to having the transfer that should be going to the Kansas Department of Transportation.
It may not pass this year, but it's a question of when we're going to do it, I think, because ultimately we have to give ourselves a budget cushion.
The budget is now in the hands of lawmakers who will make many changes before sending it back to the governor in a couple of months. And we're taking a little bit of a break from our normal format this week. I'm joined by Dion Leffler from the Wichita Eagle. He's our only guest. Dion and I both spent the week covering the State House, and so we're going to kind of share a little bit of our perspectives, things that didn't make it into the stories, things that surprised us, etc. And I know going into this, kind of the first thing that popped out of the budget that has really made headlines, but was really kind of buried, was what's being referred to now as the Netflix tax.
Yes, that is a tax. It is a new tax. They would apply the sales tax to things like streaming services, Netflix, Amazon Prime, Disney Plus, Hulu, those kinds of services, plus games that you download on your cell phone, music services like Spotify, songs you buy that you download from the internet. It's really a new frontier in taxation.
And a way that the governor can perhaps get a little bit more money. I know that she also was looking at paying down debt and trying to make some tax cuts, although there's some argument over the grocery sales tax cut and the form that that should take, whether it should be a 1 cent across the board tax cut, which a lot of Republicans are backing, or in what she's saying is it should be aimed at those who make the least, and that's why she wants to do this new form of refund that hasn't been seen in Kansas. It's not the one we used to have. She wants to get rid of that one and do something different.
Yeah, that really got complicated. But basically what it is it's a refundable tax credit. So if you don't owe taxes, you'd be able to get it. And it would compensate low-income people for their expenditures on sales tax each year. And I think that amounts to $53 million of reduction in state revenue. So it, sometimes, they raise the tax over here, they take a little tax away over here. Yeah, I mean, the food sales tax thing has been a bear for I can't remember how many years. Yeah. And every year we go up there, and every year somebody makes a speech about having some of the highest food taxes in the nation, and then every year not much happens.
Yeah. So a lot of fighting over how to do it, who it should be aimed at, even a fight over how to pay for it. Where do we raise the taxes to make up for the losses in a cut? Just very. As Rick Wilborn told me after the State of the State, there are 165 different lawmakers in Topeka and 165 different ideas.
Yeah, yeah, and I mean, this could be the year. You know, I mean, every year could be the year, but this could be the year for that because things are fairly stable in the budget. You know, I mean, we're not chasing huge deficits, you know, multi-$100 million deficits that we saw for, you know, years, and so there's money in the till there that they can spend, and so this might be the year for it because, you know, it's an election year. Republicans love tax cuts, and they like to run on that. So maybe this will be the year that it'll shake loose.
Although one thing I did find really interesting is when I was talking with Ron Reichman, the Speaker of the House, right after the State of the State, and we were discussing the grocery sales tax. And I asked him if he could support that, and he said yeah. And I asked him, but he also referenced the fact that the governor had vetoed a bill that would have cut sales tax last year. And I asked him, but she had said if you had split it off and given her just the grocery sales tax in a clean bill, she would have signed it. Is that going to happen this year? And he would not commit. So it would not surprise me to see it tied to other tax changes that perhaps the governor doesn't care for.
Yeah, and that's, you know, that's always the risk you run when you have split parties between the governor's office and the legislature. We haven't had to split in the legislature in recent memory, but yeah, it really does. I think one of the things that I noticed in this session was that it seemed more cordial.
Yes.
Than it has before. I mean, some of these things that have been suggested. I spoke with Dan Hawkins, the majority leader in the House, right after the governor's State of the State speech, and he was like, "Well, I hope she does all the things she says." I was like, "What?"
Yeah, I got some of the same responses.
It was like, you know, so it's. I noticed just a sense, a change in the tenor of the place, and it seems like maybe they may be more cooperative, you know, until we get to some of the, you know, I mean, there's going to be some bitter fights up there, and I think one of them's coming up. But
yep, one of them actually, and I'm going to stop you right there, is coming up, and it's coming up next week. Starting, it was set up this week, a major battle in Kansas over abortion rights, as anti-abortion activists introduced their proposal for a constitutional amendment on abortion. But opponents say their timeline is suspicious.
The amendment is crafted after the 6 other states that have already passed similar legislation. It simply says there's no right to abortion in the Kansas Constitution, and then kind of lays out what that would look like.
Surrounded by a couple of dozen women holding signs reading "Let Kansans vote" and "Value them both," abortion foes presented their argument for amending the Kansas Constitution. They say the amendment would protect lawmakers' rights to regulate abortions as guided by federal law under Roe v. Wade.
This protects the previous legislation that's been passed in Kansas.
They plan to push to get the amendment passed within the next 2 weeks and on to the August primary ballot for Kansans to vote on.
It's a priority for most legislators. I would like to say it's a priority for the people of Kansas. It's going to probably happen in the next 2 weeks.
This is very premature.
Opponents say it's that rush that makes the amendment suspicious to them. They point out the case this is all based on hasn't been fully settled in court yet. And they add, conservative Republicans dominate voters in the primary, while the November ballot is more likely to attract unaffiliated Democratic and moderate Republicans to the polls.
I think that this really is political gamesmanship, even though the issue is extremely important. And I think the ultimate objective is to take moderate Republicans out of the Kansas legislature.
And Carmichael pushed it even further to say it also, in his view, is an effort to help a conservative win the Kansas Senate primary. Kind of a big picture view of what is a very personal issue for a lot of Kansans.
Well, who would that be? Yeah, Senator Wagle. Obviously, is on the Senate, on the U.S. Senate ballot this year.
Yeah. But so is Chris Kobach and Roger Marshall, all three of whom are very strong anti-abortion candidates.
But the difference is that Senator Wagle is going to be seen as the point person for this particular effort.
Yeah.
And that adds to her credibility as a candidate.
No.
There's no two ways within the people who are, for whom abortion is a major voting issue.
Yeah.
And I think that Representative Carmichael's analysis of putting this on a primary ballot versus a general election ballot is spot on.
Yeah. Patrick Miller from the University of Kansas pretty much said exactly the same thing, is that this is really about getting more conservatives voting than moderates, because those are the ones who vote in the primaries.
Well, yeah, and if you look at the voting pattern, and if you look at the election ballot, you have three major conservative candidates: Senator Wagle, former Secretary of State Kobach, and Roger Marshall, the 1st District Congressman. They're going to fight it out for the Republican nomination. That's going to bring a lot of Republicans to the polls.
Conservative Republicans, not moderate Republicans.
Well, and the Democrats have already pretty much coalesced around their candidate, Senator Barbara Boyer. I always struggle with the pronunciation.
You're not alone.
So there's really not that much reason for them to come to the polls, for Democrats to come to the polls. And of course, unaffiliated voters don't get to come to the polls in a primary.
Yeah.
So, when you look at that, it's going to be a Republican show if this goes to the ballot.
Well, and then there's just the rush to have the hearings and get it through the legislative process. I mean, the polls aren't until August, even if you're talking about the primary. So why is it it was just introduced on Thursday? By end of business Friday, I think they extended the deadline for testimony until noon or 3 p.m. on Monday. But the hearing is already on Tuesday, and they're planning on bringing it to the floor, Senator Wagle said, within a couple of weeks. That is like warp speed in legislative terms.
Especially at this time of the session.
Yes.
If it were late in the session and something was moving that quickly, it wouldn't be that big of a surprise. But at the beginning of the session, we still have months and months and months of legislature. Now, maybe they're concerned that it could bump up against, the
big
ballot
issues.
process. Well, against the ballot process of getting things onto the ballot in time to meet the federal deadlines for mailing overseas voters and servicemen their ballots and those kinds of things.
Yeah.
They might want to be able to have that, fully crafted. And it does leave them some time for if there's some dissent that arises in their in the Republican caucus.
Yeah, because I know before there had been some dissent just on the wording and whether or not it should completely ban abortion or just say that the state can regulate abortion, which seems to be what this group is saying. And I have to put the caveat in, we haven't actually seen the language on this proposal yet.
Yes, we have not. And it's an extension of a tactic that's been tried in previous elections. When you look at what, in previous elections, they've gone after the justices. They've gone after the justices on the Supreme Court, tried to get them voted out in the retention elections, and they have not had much success with it. They've had no success with that.
Yeah, all 7 were retained in the last time around.
Yeah, so they've had no success there. This is an effort to tie the justices' hands and say that they just don't get to say, they had ruled that there's a right to abortion guaranteed by the state constitution. Now they're playing a long game here, and what the end result or the end goal of this is that if Roe v. Wade, which protects abortion rights nationwide, is overturned, then the brakes are off, and the states can do pretty much whatever they want. Well, they're trying to get the Supreme Court out of the way before the Roe v. Wade challenge
comes up. And actually, one thing that does differentiate this proposal as introduced to us Thursday, again, we haven't actually seen the language, but we've been told that it includes the language as mandated by Roe v. Wade, which is it's based on 6 other states that have similar legislation in place already, but they don't have that particular phrase in it. Ours would is introduced.
Yeah, and that could be I mean, what happens if Roe v. Wade is overturned? And
What does that do to the amendment?
well, yeah, and what would if Roe v. Wade is overturned but replaced with another decision, that could, if it's tied to Roe v. Wade,
Yeah.
then and it will depend very much on how that's written, because if it's the rights that are guaranteed by Roe v. Wade, and then Roe v. Wade is overturned, or Roe v. Wade is altered by another case with another header. Then they could be stuck with Roe v. Wade.
Didn't think about that aspect.
So
Yeah.
they could be if it's not written properly, they could freeze
System in Kansas, where
Kansas
it's
legislation into the tenets of Roe v. Wade. So
Yeah.
we'll have to see how that works out.
It's going to be very interesting to see how it's written, and I'm hopeful that we will see that before the hearing on Tuesday at 9 a.m. I certainly know I'm going to be there. I presume that somebody from the Eagle will be there as well.
We'll have coverage of that.
I have no doubt. Well, it wasn't the only thing going on at the State House this week. There was also a lot of furor over what some called an unprecedented field trip on Tuesday. At the urging of the Attorney General's office, lawmakers boarded buses for a closed-door security briefing over at Forbes Field, a trip lawmakers later called routine. The biggest talker of day 2 of the 2020 session was a highly protected security briefing at Forbes Field. Though it had been in the works for a month, the briefing came as a surprise to most lawmakers.
All I've heard is that we are getting a briefing from Homeland Security. Beyond that, I have not heard anything about what it might be about.
Leadership says they kept the briefing behind closed doors at the request of the Attorney General, even though longtime lawmakers like House Minority Leader Tom Sawyer say they'd never seen anything like that before.
So that's the first time in my 30 years the legislature has been briefed like this. Even during 9/11, we didn't do anything like this.
Afterward, several lawmakers said they weren't sure why all the fuss. On background, they told me the briefing was just a warning against accepting overseas trips paid for by other countries or internationally based companies, and to be aware that international agents might be trying to get information about technological and agricultural innovations in Kansas. So basically what they were talking about was trade secrets.
Yeah. Exactly. It's, and that is a big deal.
Oh, yeah. I mean, not trying to put that down at all.
No,
but the question is why did that have to be a top secret briefing?
Well, one never knows, do one? But usually when the place clears out like that, involves
a fire alarm or a tornado warning.
or an open bar.
Oh, yeah.
But no, I mean, I've talked to several legislators about what this was about, and it was primarily, like you say, protection of intellectual property, which is not generally something where you need to where you need to bus people to a former Air Force base to hear about.
Now they did, of course, also get a tour of the base, so I guess they did a twofer.
Yeah, I guess so. But it was kind of interesting because I think you probably got some, why did they separate the Democrats and Republicans?
I got a lot of those questions. And, of course, a lot of conspiracy theories about separating them. But it really was about closing the caucuses, and that's why they had to split the two groups. Yes, I did not include in my story the fact that they couldn't fit the entire House in the facilities at Forbes Field at once because 125 people, that's a lot of folks.
Right.
But the reason they split them into two groups or into Democrats and Republicans, instead of just saying, A through J and K through Z or something, was to close the caucuses.
Yeah, because they can do that if it's if they're separated by, it's a very unusual sort of thing in the, in the Kansas open meetings law. If they just, if you have all Democrats or all Republicans, they can close it, but if they mix them, they can't. And it's just like, that seems weird to me. But, the Kansas open meetings law, as we know, is not, is probably not one, how shall I say this?
It's not the most open of open meeting laws in the country.
Yeah, it's not a premier example of government transparency.
Me personally, I think if you got 5 lawmakers in a room, it should be an open meeting.
Well, yeah, and I think most people, would agree with you that, You know, if they're doing government business, they ought to be doing it in the open.
As much as possible.
As much as, yeah, I mean,
Yeah.
and I mean, I didn't find anybody here who told me that there was anything in this briefing
note. Yeah.
that needed to be done behind closed doors. You know, I mean, it was basically just warnings about industrial espionage,
Yep.
which, you know, is a big deal. You know, I mean,
Yeah.
and cybersecurity and that
Yeah.
kind of thing, but, you know, I mean, it's
know.
like,
And even some of the lawmakers that we spoke with were, before they went on this trip, were a little freaked out. You know, some were saying, it sounds like there's some sort of emergency. It feels like there's an urgency to this. What's going on? And then afterwards, they're like, I don't know what all the fuss was about.
yeah, you know, I mean, and it, you know, I mean, it did have sort of that apocalyptic,
Yeah.
you know, designated survivor, you know, we've got to get these people away from the Capitol because something's, you know, something's horrible is about to happen. But it really was just a, you know, I mean, like I say, everybody I've talked to said that they weren't sure why we actually did it this way, you know, and why the press wasn't allowed and why it had to be a closed door thing and all that.
Well, and it really overshadowed a lot of other things that were going on that day. For example, Secretary of State Scott Schwab made some pretty big announcements when he was giving lawmakers briefings that really kind of didn't make the news. In light of recent news about successful hacks into election systems in Illinois and Georgia, Schwab says our election system could use an extra layer of security. Secretary of State Scott Schwab announced plans to create the position of an election security IT director for the state.
We're going to hire an election security officer, and that person is going to be an IT individual to make sure they're training the county clerks on how to protect systems from security. The other portion is we're going to be putting some proprietary systems out there for the poll book only.
While voting machines in Kansas are never connected to the internet, the poll books with a list of registered voters are. Putting them on a separate system would protect them from cyber breaches, intentional or accidental.
A county computer that could also have clickbait malware and also be infiltrated by, let's say, the county treasurer's office. They decide to click on something. Well, that gets into our system through the back door, even though the county clerk didn't do it.
Yeah, and when I've been doing a series starting in November, and we're going to do it once a month all the way through the year over on Cake about election security. And when I talked most recently with Tabitha Lehman in the Sedgwick County's elections office, she made the comment that we have a lot of resources that a lot of these other counties don't. And that is what Schwab said this election security officer really would be about, would be helping to fill those gaps for those other counties.
Yeah. Well, and one of the things too, kind of a spin-off of this, was that, remember that bill that they passed to allow voters to vote at any polling place in their county? Well, that's not going to be in place for the 2020 election.
No.
And that was something that that Scott Schwab announced at that election committee.
Yes, when I talked with him, he said it's still working through the rules process. They've got the committee. They're working on getting the rules in place, but then they still have to get approval from Homeland Security, a couple of other places, and a whole process they've got to go through. And then he made the point too that I really don't want to debut something like this that could have an error in it on a major election. I'd rather do it on a small local election where if there is a problem, we only have to fix something small, as opposed to a presidential election or the Kansas Senate primary, that sort of thing. And I can see that point.
I think all elections are important.
Oh, I totally agree, but it's a matter of scale.
Well, yeah, and in Sedgwick County, this is mature technology.
Yes.
We do this. We've been doing it for the advanced balloting, the advanced voting sites for years, and we rented, Sedgwick County rented space on a secure network, and that's how they secured it. And other counties could do that too. Yeah. But who knows? What the
Yeah. Well, and I know, and I'm going to end this conversation here, but I know when I spoke with county commissioners, several of them have said, let us debut it, figure out how to work it, and then we can use that to set the rules and get it going from there. But that's not the way the Secretary of State's office wants to run it, and they're in charge.
Yep.
One other thing that they were talking about this week at the State House that could become a big issue throughout the session, broadband access. It came out of the Rural Prosperity Tour that the Lieutenant Governor was on this week. Take a look at what he had to say.
But the biggest thing that we need to address in rural Kansas is actually broadband.
Monday afternoon, State Representative Troy Waymaster from Bunker Hill touted the benefits of expanding broadband access to western Kansas communities like his.
Not only for just a connectivity to the internet, but also we're looking at broadband for the next transportation plan as well. I actually traveled to Microsoft headquarters in September, and they were talking about a very rural community in Delaware that actually put the infrastructure in for broadband, and that was able to address all of their needs as far as commerce, economic development, health care.
From access to quality health care to government programs meant to spur economic development, even a good education. All the things Lieutenant Governor Lynn Rogers said rural communities told him they need as he unveiled the results of his Rural Prosperity Report.
Folks in urban areas, rural communities define prosperity as having access to good paying jobs that let them raise a family and have a secure future.
Report not only highlighted the need for expanded broadband access to all corners of the state, it showed many economic incentive programs are designed for the cities and need to be reworked to help areas with fewer people living in them.
Too few people think about this, but broadband is really the highways and railroads of connecting businesses and communities and consumers to our markets.
The next step will be the formation of 3 interagency work groups to look at what can be done about increasing access to affordable housing and childcare, as well as increasing workforce recruitment and education. But before anything happens along those lines, lawmakers from western Kansas are hopeful they'll see progress on expanding broadband access.
There's going to have to be some infrastructure put into place to put broadband.
And we know that broadband has been something lawmakers have been looking at. They had the broadband task force. What do you think chances are there's going to be some sort of legislation this session on broadband?
I think it's probably not going to be very effective, frankly.
Really?
I think that when you're talking about this, what you're talking about is like the historic changes, rural electrification, rural telephones.
Yes, it's been compared to that several times.
I mean, those are the stakes you're talking about. The only way to do a project like that is going to be through big government.
All right. Well, and we'll have to see how that holds up in Kansas. Well, thank you so much, Diana. It's been an enjoyable time talking with this. I hope you have enjoyed it as well. We'd love to hear from you. If you want to share your ideas or comments, please contact us at kansasweek@kpts.org. For now, have a great week.